people know who Canada is. Like, we don't need to go and wave a flag and, hand out, little maple leaf pins at some event somewhere. We've got to get shit done. We've got to go and win and compete for business day in and day out and create the national infrastructure, that foundational infrastructure that's required. Hello, I'm Mark Wiseman. I'm chairman of the board of AIMCO and a senior advisor to Lazard and to BCG, the Boston Consulting Group.
Thank you so much for being with us, Mark. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, primarily because you wrote a really interesting opinion piece recently that I really want to dive into with you. Let's get right into it. You wrote the piece that you titled, "Ottawa Should Accelerate Private Investment in Renewable Energy and Digital Infrastructure." And your piece states that and I quote, "We're at an inflection point for industrial policy and infrastructure building." So before we get into your vision for this next industrial revolution and what Canada has to do to win within it, could you please outline the forces or trends that you identify that have led us to this inflection point and what these forces mean for Canada and our future economy?
Infrastructure is incredibly important to create a long-term productive economy. If we're going to operate and grow our economy, grow productivity in Canada, we need to have infrastructure that will allow us to do that. You can think about transportation. It's hard to produce goods if you don't have a way of getting them to market by rail, by canal, in the old days, airports, roads, etc. So given that background, what are the two trends and why are we at an inflection point today? There's two very key trends. The first trend is the transition, what I call the transition economy. And what is that? There is a move afoot around the world to transition from high carbon energy production to low carbon or no carbon energy production. And that changes a lot. So energy is incredibly important to the modern economy. It's more and more important. We're consuming more of it. And it's equally important around the world for a whole bunch of reasons that energy be made from sources that produces less in terms of GHG emissions. So that's the first trend. And so a critical part of infrastructure that helps to fuel the economy, so to speak, is around energy. And so that is changing, and it's changing quite quickly and quite dramatically. So we need to upgrade and transition to a lower carbon set of energy infrastructure for the country. The second trend is really driven by geopolitics, and that is the trend to bringing supply chains closer to home. As Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, says, to friendshoring productive capacity. And we've learned that in our own country, recently with the pandemic, and we saw some of the issues that came about because we don't produce PPE in Canada. We don't produce vaccines in Canada. So we're all coming to the realization, for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is geopolitics, that bringing critical productive capacity onshore or friendshoring is very important. And so we need the infrastructure to allow us to do that. And by the way, the opportunity in Canada is not just to produce for ourselves those critical components, but it's actually to produce it for our friends, not least of which is, of course, the United States.
Well, in the piece, you put all those forces and trends in front of us that have got us here. And then you argue that because of those, Canada has to focus on a few key sectors or a few key areas. You highlighted renewable energy, digital infrastructure, chip manufacturing as EVs, as these key industries that Canada really has to focus on to win in this next industrial evolution. If you look at those four sectors, what do you see as those foundational elements that government should be focusing on to then enable industry to grow on top?
Yeah, so there's a number of things. Obviously, it's having a green grid. I mean, that becomes very important. And we've been very slow in Canada. Partially, that's jurisdictional between, like many, many things that slow us down in our country. It's jurisdictional between federal and provincial jurisdiction. But it's also ensuring that that research and development is encouraged in the private sector, and then providing subsidies into those areas. So, if you look at our neighbors to the south, and you see what they've done very recently and very quickly, both with legislation like the CHIPS Act, which is used to subsidize and encourage private sector investment in semiconductor manufacturing in the United States, um, or what they've done with the Inflation Reduction Act, which, among other things, has given a big advantage to renewables, in particular hydrogen projects in the US versus Canada. So, what the US has done, and Europe's done the same, but it's been very effective in the US, and it's moved very quickly, is creating sort of the conditions for the private sector, or crowding in essentially that private capital to build some of those critical elements. So it's both building the foundation and then creating the economic conditions and the including permitting, including sometimes subsidization, to have the private sector uh, do those things that will create the multiplier effect in the economy.
You do highlight other stakeholders and a particular relationship that is going to be important in driving this forward. And it's the relationship between Canadian corporations and our financial institutions. And I want to quote the last line of your piece. You wrote that, quote, partnerships that allow companies to leverage their competitive advantages and incentivize investors to deploy their capital to increase capacity and reduce financial burdens for corporations will be the defining feature of this next industrial revolution. So, firstly, could you please expand on this relationship and the dynamics between Canadian corporations and our financial institutions? And what do each of these groups have to do now to capitalize on this opportunity that's represented by the inflection point that we're currently at?
So look, I think there's really three pieces to the puzzle. There's capital, there's the corporate sort of development piece of it, and then there's of course government, both through finance and policy. Let's start with the capital piece. Let's address each of the three. Starting with the capital piece, we have a great advantage in Canada. We have built up an investment community through our pension funds, of which I'm have been and am involved, the so-called Maple 8, where we're incredibly professional global investors. And beyond that, we've also built up expertise in our insurance companies, in our banking sector, and indeed in private organizations that are large-scale investors like Brookfield. So we have sort of disproportionate strength globally in terms of being providers of capital. And today we export a lot of that capital. We're investing in the types of projects we're talking about around the world. So the question is, how do we get more of that to sit at home? Secondly, we need corporations to actually, and here we failed, and in many respects, but we need Canadian corporations, the private sector, to be on the front foot in terms of innovation and building out that type of capacity in the areas that we talked about in Canada. So, you can throw a party with a bunch of capital, but if no one's there to have an investable project, there's nowhere for it to go. And so we need to, I think, expect more of not just large Canadian companies, but Canadian entrepreneurs in terms of developing domestic capacity in the areas that we talked about. And the third component is, of course, government policy. That's everything from tax policy to subsidies for certain types of activities to permitting, which is incredibly important, and even the government's own procurement policies. All three of those pieces of the triangle need to work. And if anyone is missing, it just won't happen. So there's a degree of coordination that has to take place to ensure that we have an industrial policy that moves ourselves in that direction.
How would you formalize or like to see that degree of coordination formalized? What does that look like to you in terms of driving all of this forward?
So a lot of the policy direction is kind of there up at 60,000 feet. But 60,000 feet, is really nice, but it doesn't have an effect. We got to get down to the ground. We've got to be, blocking and tackling, just even in areas like permitting, and then we've got to be competing. So let's go back to the chips example. Not all of the semiconductor manufacturing is going to take place in the United States. It's called friendshoring, right? The whole policy is yes, we want productive capacity in the United States, but we also want productive capacity in and among our friends. Well, who are the friends of the United States? Canada's certainly among them. I hope top or near the top among them, but so is Germany, so is France, so is Italy, so is Singapore, so is Japan. And so, we need to be in a position where we are winning at least our fair share of kind of US corporate productive capacity.
When I hear you speak about this, and I think specifically about the government's role in this, I hear permitting, I hear we have to be more attractive, we have to basically make people aware, or I should say, make companies aware of the tremendous advantages that Canada
Yeah.
presents
Yeah.
to them.
But Tim, I'm going to stop you for a second. This whole make companies aware nonsense. Like, I am so tired of this. Like, we don't need another trade mission. Okay. Like, people know who Canada is. Like, we don't need to go and wave a flag and, hand out, little maple leaf pins at some event somewhere, or, give people, miniature bottles of maple syrup and have another speech by some politician. We've got to get shit done. We've got to get policy in place and not do sort of events and ads in newspapers and handing out pins. We've got to go and win and compete for business day in and day out and create the national infrastructure, that foundational infrastructure that's required. If you want to see the evidence of us not getting shit done, you can look at the growing productivity gap between Canada and the United States, right? That productivity gap has grown for the last 30 years, has continued to grow. Be it what the US has done again in the CHIPS Act or what they've done in the not so aptly named Inflation Reduction Act. You look with the subsidies that are going to encourage the building of green hydrogen capacity. No green hydrogen is going to get built in Canada. We're fooling ourselves, because economically now it makes way more sense with the Inflation Reduction Act. It is much more economic to build that capacity in the US. So those corporates and that capital are going to go where? They're going to go to the United States of America.
What needs to be done to accelerate investment in those key spaces, renewables, digital infrastructure, and the other industries that you have identified as very important to our future economy? So you've had lots to say already, but first, the government. What's that one thing they need to do now?
The government needs to get things done. Stop fussing with policy and start fussing with implementation.
What would your calls to action be for Canada's largest investment managers?
Focus on good risk adjusted opportunities at home as well as abroad.
Next is business slash industry. What do you have to say to them?
Spend on R&D and long-term business development. I think we're way too short-term in the way that our corporations operate. Be long-term, invest in the future.
And the last one I have is the Canadian public. Anything for all of us? What do we have to keep in mind?
Demand more from all three of those critical stakeholders. Don't be complacent. Canadians are complacent. We live well. We live in a fantastic country, but it's very easy to be comfortable. And in many respects, we are a country that is essentially a collection of the proverbial frog in the pot. And we have to understand that the water is getting hotter and hotter around us, and it's time to jump.